thanks for having me. You know, I didn't tell Riaz the name of the talk, which was my bad. It's actually testing the wrong way, which is how I test and how I want to teach you to test too. So I hope you're not disappointed, but I'm glad you're here anyway. So I'm a Ruby developer. I've been working in Ruby almost every day for 10 years, and I started testing one way, and now I'm testing a different way. And so that's what I kind of want to talk about, is that transition. And really, this is something that's been kind of brewing for a while through my transition. I work from home a lot, so I don't get out to talk to a lot of developers face to face. So I've wanted to sort of just have a conversation, check back in on what people are doing, and talk to you about what I'm doing now. So can I see a show of hands if you use R-Spec or a spec style testing library? Okay, pretty good, pretty good. So if you don't know, R-Spec is it's a testing library for Ruby that focuses on kind of a natural language, kind of readable syntax, and is designed to be used as a specification. I'll talk more about that. But first, I just want to acknowledge something about a topic like testing and trying to give a presentation on it. Testing's the realm of subjective assessment, especially something like good testing or bad testing or something like that. And so you can talk a lot about it. There's a lot of nuance. I have my narrative point of view on this topic, and I'm going to construct my examples in a way that communicates clearly to you some things that I see as challenges to testing, and some things that are solutions to some of those problems. So when you have to do that and fit code examples onto a small slide, you don't have a lot of room. Sometimes it can seem kind of contrived, like you're just setting it up just to knock it down again. But I'd encourage you, and I feel this way if I read like a book about object-oriented design or something, and they're like code examples where there's a class for like a sprocket and a class for a chain or something, and I'm like, this is trivial, But I just encourage you to keep an open mind in how what I'm talking about in these small examples could be blown up to, bigger challenges that we see every day. So, my journey to Ruby, Rails, and testing really started in 2008. I was at a startup, and we transitioned from PHP to Rails and therefore Ruby, and so and that was, pretty big hype for Rails then. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty common thing to have happen in 2008 is for your company to switch to Rails, because I don't think it was quite cresting the hype cycle yet, but there was definitely a lot of hype around it. And at that time, here in Atlanta, being a Ruby developer, and there was a lot of interest and hype around R-Spec too. BDD style testing, a lot of interest in the Ruby community and testing in general. And there were a lot of new things about it. I mean, Rails was kind of the killer app for Ruby, so if you got into Rails, that was relatively new. And then Ruby was new to you because nobody did Ruby before Rails, or few people did. And then testing was kind of new to a lot of people too, or at least, the rapid feedback testing and some of the things we saw in Ruby at the time. So there was a lot of new, and there were also a lot of the programmers. So a lot of the programmers were not very experienced in Ruby, but also not very experienced in development. And so I think in that, process of trying to find our way through all this new technology and learn how to get, there's a lot of, it's a situation that's ripe for, a lot of kind of overzealous choices and groupthink and advocacy of ideas that people, that sound good and that people like to say, and that it's easy to adopt and it feels good to practice, but that, maybe sometimes people kind of turn their brains off and don't critically analyze what they're doing. And so I'm not saying that R-Spec or BDD or anything that came out of that time period is the equivalent of snake handling. I'm not actually saying that. I'm just saying that a lot of us we're drinking the Kool-Aid and passing the Kool-Aid to somebody else, and how would we know, if it was or it wasn't? So I'm going to talk about some of the best practices, kind of tenets that kind of came out of like testing in this style, and this is definitely true and stuff that almost 10 years ago was like told to me, and I think it's still kind of true today, having looked up some R-Spec examples, is, at the time, there was a real emphasis on 100% test coverage, but not really but it was a real focus on 100% test coverage of your models or your core classes in your application. And there was almost a fixation on, if you write a method, you have like a one-to-one, either one-to-one or a many-to-one ratio of tests to methods that you write in of like kind of model classes or core business logic. So the other hallmark of this is you were encouraged not to think of your tests as just tests, but rather as specifications or specs, as they're pithily called sometimes. And so we were encouraged to think, okay, you don't even need to read the application code to find out how something works. Ideally the test could serve as a documentation to prove how it works and to show you and tell you about the class. And so, and to that end, R-Spec gives you a number of tools, the describe, context, let, subject, natural language things that are there to kind of enforce that this is like how you are describing, the system under test. And there was a real emphasis on keeping your test code dry, reuse, granular tests that should be like one assertion per test case. Does any of that sound like it's still true today, that this is what's advocated for like R-Spec style testing? Okay. Well, good. So maybe my presentation will be relevant to today and not to 10 years ago. So, I used this style for a long time and followed these best practices. And, I found that I felt like I was just constantly getting tangled up in tests that I had written that I had forgotten about. I felt like they weren't easy to maintain. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to some code. I'm going to show you some R-Spec code, and then we'll show you which is the right way to do it. And then I'll show you how I test today, which is the wrong way. And then we'll sort of analyze them a little bit more deeply. So here's an example of kind of some R-Spec code that I would find to be fairly typical of if you're doing TDD or BDD and you define a class and you're starting out this class, you might write something like this. Can you all see that? Is that something you can see? Okay. Well, just take a second to read it and figure out what it does, because this is the spec for this class. Okay.
Or spec because it's exercising specific functionality and not the why.
Good, good, yes. Yeah, exactly. That's good. Okay. So you head of the... Right. Exactly. Okay. Okay, good. So, well, Frank's called it, I did tests like this for a long time, and I've seen tests like this written. So what does this do? Well, can you tell me what the system under test does?
A new user that is active, it's then using that to test this thing called a reserver, and then it is doing some booleans about whether or not a reservation can be made only if the user's active and not if the user's inactive.
That's right. Yep. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. So the reserver is actually the system that's under test here. User is what we call like a dependency of the system. And then what the function of the reserver is to determine if somebody can make a reservation or not. It's kind of a decorator class. Simple. And simple to write, but the test code is pretty long. And so does anybody have any reactions to that? That was good, Frank. Does anybody else have any reactions to this test code? That's right. Yeah. Yep. Which is tricky. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's tricky, especially when maybe the lets and the associations are defined all at the top of the file, kind of like this could be. There's no line numbers here, but you can assume it's at the top of the file. And say like your actual test case is like 2 pages down, and you don't actually see, right? So I think, another reaction, one, this is, and I should say this, I should have clarified this. This is kind of mini-test spec format. I do mini-test, and I still use the spec, even though this is kind of like a critique of some of the spec style testing. I still use the spec style library and write it this way, but it's in mini-test, not R-Spec. R-Spec has a little bit different expectations now, I think, that kind of people are guided towards. But I think you could look at this and you could say, this followed all the rules that we had kind of laid out previously. And you could say that and so you could say, hey, this looks good. You say, oh, Frank, hey, this has got some problems. It doesn't get to the heart of what's actually being tested, which is very true. And you could also say, John, nobody would do all these rules at once. Yeah.
If you're overriding the user on the second one,
Yes.
is the subject's user still the first one or the second one?
It's the second one. Yep. That's part of the ambiguity of it. Yep. Exactly. Yep. Good question.
Because every test, or maybe I don't need to explain, every test starts out as a fresh slate, and it bubbles out based on
Right.
its access.
Right. So, I wrote tons of tests like this, and I think people still do, and that's part of where this presentation comes from. Now, this is how I would write this test. If I were writing a test, I would write it like this. I think this gets to the heart of what you're talking about, Frank, that at least summarizes what the thing does. And then it also has some other stylistic shifts that make it a little bit clearer what's being tested at any time. But let me bounce back to this example and talk specifically about kind of some problems and where the problems are. In essence, I think that the challenge here is it's a comprehension challenge. It takes work to actually think about what is being tested, where the references come from, that sort of thing. So let me just walk through. And things kind of go, in my opinion, they kind of become problematic immediately. At the top where you have the lead and the subject, the way this works, if you're not familiar, is that it's using this language to define some fixtures for the test cases that are running underneath. Specifically, when I call let user, and I give it that user new active true, what's happening there is it defines a method called user, which when invoked the first time, it will evaluate what's in the braces, return that new user, cache it, and then subsequent times when you call it, it will just return the same instance again. Subject is similar, except that it has a special name, subject. We specified what user was called. We could have called it Bob. But subject is like a special one in the sort of R-Spec and spec world. So, and then subject, you can see, it defines the dependency on user. So when I call in my execution, when I reference subject from a test case, it will invoke the subject, execute the block, what's in the braces. Inside there, it actually asks for the user, so then it executes that one, returns the user, returns the reserver, and then we start the test. And so that's kind of how it works if you're not familiar with this. But the global shared state, I think, is a big part of the problem here, is that if you start depending on this for multiple test cases, depending on how bad it is, it's not too bad with 2 test cases and 15 lines of code that fit on a slide. But when you start talking about a lot, you can have this challenge where you start jockeying for adding more things to your fixtures. Then there's the overriding problem, which we'll talk about. Now, number two, the problem I see is this morass of nested describes that require mental gymnastics just to concatenate together the test description to see what's being tested. And also, two, to resolve tokens and test references. It's not clear where subject, you have to first load into your brain that subject is a thing that comes, where it's defined at, which one we're talking about. And it becomes worse when you start overriding those dependencies and test fixtures and stuff. So that's a big part of the problem. And so what this does, to read out the test, there are two test cases here, and the test case starts with can make reservation when the user is active, returns true, can make reservation when the user is inactive, returns false. But it takes work in your brain to do that. I personally want to save my work for like application code, not for test code. I don't want my tests to be too smart. So three, another problem is, as Frank noted, is that the implementation details pollute the test description in the form of A, the method being called, and B, a return value. It tells you nothing about the context, like what this thing actually is intended to do. Instead, it focuses specifically on situations. And then lastly, as you noted, like which user is actually being used is, yes, even though the association is defined between subject and user is defined on the same level at the top, we override subject in that deeper nested scope. Therefore, the subject that's called by the second, in the second test case actually gets the second user, which can be pretty tricky if, again, your test file's longer and depending on how things are spaced out. It just can require a lot of work to kind of load this into your brain to get you to that point that you can be productive. So, this example, the simpler example, I'll walk through specifically what I think it did right to improve on it. First, we just flattened the nesting into a single, more readable test case. It just becomes like more straightforward. And it runs kind of like a script instead of like a, an inheritance hierarchy or something that you have to juggle in your brain to figure out. Two, we have a clear business promise that is being tested here. It ensures only active members can make reservations. So that tells you, like Frank noted, that tells you exactly what's going to be tested. Three, we stage the test dependencies inside the test case, made possible by the magic of local variables. It's very simple to see active user. We can even supply some context, active user, inactive user. And it's very straightforward so that when we see those later on in the file, there's no question about where they came from. It didn't use Ruby magic and implicit receiver and, language constructs to set up our test. And then finally, we use as many assertions as we need to test and prove this feature, to challenge and prove the business promise that's made in the test description. We don't limit ourselves to one. I also happen to here use the sort of standard mini-test or test unit assertions rather than the R-Spec-ish style expectations to do this, because I just think it's simpler to read. You kind of see what's happening there. So in this case, this does the same thing, and I think it does it in a much more straightforward way. And most of the tests that I have now kind of follow this format. I try to keep the file pretty flat, have just a bunch of test cases in there. I try to avoid using describes if I can help it in some of those R-Spec language formats. But the test will start out, it'll have a business promise. It has setup inside the test case, and then it has confirmation. So, that's most of the presentation. I've got a little bit more. I want to talk specifically about being explicit in your tests and how that can serve to make our tests more robust and serve to make them more clear. So here I'm using a factory library. I do use factories, by the way, despite how this has seemed so far. I mean, I do use factories, and there is some case to be made for reuse in tests. So, you know, in this case, you can probably see what's happening here. We've got a user model. It's got a method called full name that returns the first and last name together. So we're just testing that kind of simple test. But we've defined a factory to help us with this. So inside our test case, we create a user using that factory. That'll give us the factory back. And then we make an assertion about what full name returns. Now here we're not being explicit about what the expectation is. Instead, we're relying on what we set up to provide the answer, which I think is, I think I have done that before, and other people do that. And I think the idea is that, well, I just want to define what the name is, the first and last name is once, and then I don't want my test to fail if I change that name or the name changes. But the better way, in my opinion, is better to be explicit about it. Just go ahead and type it again, right? So in this case, we will assert that full name is actually John Doe that way, so that if something goes wrong with our first name and last name methods, we find out about it. The expectation's violated. This is actually makes our code more like outside in, right? Because we have the expectations defined separately. I think of this as like, what would I do if I were debugging a problem in production? Somebody's like, so-and-so can't make a reservation, or so-and-so's getting the wrong price on something, and I'd go and I'd look and I'd be like, well, that's not what I expected, and I'd like tinker around in the console a little bit. I feel like writing these tests is kind of like that. You know, you're defining your expectations, your assertions should be separate from the data that you've staged. Obviously dependent in terms of dependent in terms of what the expectations are. The other thing is that this needs to be explicit is that if the test details are important to what you're testing, you need to put the relevant details in the test case. Don't rely on defaults or factories or whatever. Try to include it in here. Now we have a test that's pretty robust. One, it's clearer what the expectations are. You can actually read this and see kind of how it works. You don't kind of re-implement the method in your test like this one does. And so it's good to be implicit or explicit about your data. I see this happen with dates too. I mean, too often people rely on in their tests like relative dates or whatever in tests instead of trying to be explicit about what the dates are and what should be expected. Obviously there's a limit to this. You know, if you have a model where it's something is populated by the database, for example, and you can't control the auto increment, okay. But if you can control it, take ownership of it in your setup and then make the expectation separate. So if you wanted, say you've done things the right way and it hasn't worked out for you and you want to try a new cult of testing my way, the wrong way, here's the advice. You know, you test key business deliverables in the form of overarching test cases. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if you explicitly say the first and last name, what becomes the point of the factory that you define?
The factory, as I see it, factories are there to fulfill requirements of the system that may not actually be under test. So it's a way to give you to generate the object. Say, for example, first name and last name is a requirement to save the model. You know, in this case, that's almost all that was there. But, you know, there may be other stuff, and you may test in other places. So I'd say it's there. Factories are there to make it easy to create objects that pass validation. You know, you could have traits and stuff too that configure your factory or your model according to some predetermined thing. The point is, though, that if the details are relevant to how the code under test functions, make sure you take ownership of that in the test case and don't rely on some outside thing to do what you're going to make an assertion on. Yeah, that's a good question. So, key business deliverables, not kind of codey details, return values, method calls. Isolate test cases from each other by localizing the dependencies and setup inside the test case. Always be willing to sacrifice dryness to clarity. You know, there's a reason that we want to be dry. We don't, but like, if you need a little bit of duplication, it's okay, you know. And test code should really impress, not with how clever it is, but like how easy it is to get in and prove that something works, satisfy your curiosity, you know, how straightforward it is. That's what matters. Be explicit, and then always use feel free to use as many assertions as you need to prove your test case. You don't need to do this granular thing. Now that you're focused on overarching deliverables and test cases, you know, you'll probably need more than one assertion. And lastly, tests are tests. That's a good thing. They don't have to aspire to be more than that. And I would argue that some of these more readable may be better to help to document and troubleshoot problems. So, in summary, I mean, I think when I started, just like with Rails, you know, Rails was very much at least in 2008, it was kind of like a bash fest on PHP and Java. And I had never done Java, really, professionally. And R-Spec was kind of the same way, as sort of a reaction to test unit and a certain kind of style of testing. And, you know, I maybe did some test unit tests, but then I just got on board with this R-Spec thing and kept going. And so some of this has been kind of finding my way back to test unit in a simpler, more, what I would say is more straightforward testing style. Anyway, does anybody have any questions or conversation? Yep, shoot.
I kind of, first of all, I completely agree with almost everything you said. It's awesome.
Yep.
Because I usually disagree with people who don't. I actually came to a lot of the same kind of conclusions, like especially like the dry thing. And I'm so glad that you said that, because
Yeah.
you hear people who are like they're kind of diehard on like the whole dry thing.
Right.
And I think I follow that usually when I'm writing like actual code that's going to run, but I think that I'm almost now the inverse when it comes to tests.
Right.
And I like verbosity because of the clarity thing.
Yep.
My motivations were actually a little bit different in that it's actually in reaction to a fragility in testing, right? Like when you maintain an application for a really long time, a lot of times your tests become very fragile. What I mean by that is not one test breaks when you change a thing, 100 break.
Yeah. Right.
And,
Yeah.
keeping them simple and verbose and easy to read, easy to consume really helps with that and helps keep fatigue down in test fragility.
I agree. I think that, what I would see is the same thing. I never saw that fulfilled promise of like, well, if you have all these granular tests, if something goes wrong, you can like pinpoint exactly where the problem is. Because usually when something would be changed and go wrong, it would be like a handful of things would fail, not just one thing, And I found that you get specifically on the sort of number of assertions and stuff, you get a line number when the assertion fails, like you get the test description about what's failing, and you get a line number, so I don't think that you need exactly the granular test to tell you what's going wrong. I agree. Shoot, Riaz.
If you can jump back a slide or two, I sort of like, that one. So here's where I'm kind of conflicted. I agree with what you said, it's sort of related to that. So like, if I'm thinking of our tests, in our factories, we will use like Baker check or something like that.
Right.
To actually generate the first and last name.
Yep.
And one of the reasons we do that, I'll give you an example. So like years ago, I worked at a company where someone wrote a method like that full name thing.
Yep.
And they didn't realize that Rails HTML escaped all the characters, so they freaked out and did a thing that like said
Okay.
So if you're using generator, it's probably going to spend the time put a last name with a hyphen in, and therefore your test would have caught that.
Mm-hmm.
If you were like doing your previous version, which is like, hey, interpolate the two variables instead of inserting an explicit one.
Right.
But I don't know how to reconcile the two, because in this case, if I use explicit ones, I'm going to pick one that makes sense, like E and Curtis.
Right.
But using generators, that would force me into the other pattern to be less explicit, and in effect really copy my code. Because the last one, most likely, you know, the code behind the full name is probably string interpolation.
Right.
Like it's literally copying your code.
Right.
And I don't have an answer for this. It's always bothered me. But I'm like, is there a solution that I can't see of this problem? Like, how can I get the best of both worlds?
So you're relying on the faker gem to basically do some some variant insertion so that you will get some.
I mean, from what I learned, that was one of the purposes
Yeah.
of using the tool like that.
Yeah, that's
That
interesting.
If you say, give me a phone number, give me a name, it's going to put it in a reasonable randomness that you will get failure sometimes if your tests are really tough to work with, like literally.
Cheap buzz test.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like imagine someone said, trim names that are longer than 8 characters. Your test that you chose didn't have that. Like you're getting a little less coverage. So I like that, but at the same time, I agree that I feel like sometimes I am just copying my own code in tests.
Right.
For
Right.
simple methods like that, and I feel like well, I didn't put any value out of it. So it's copying my own code, and all I verified was someone to change the source code. Right.
Right.
But you also start talking about later down the road, that method is covered. Even if your test is almost duplicating the method, it's still covered. So if you do go and change it, you know, to reverse the method, you go true or false, the false to true, then it's going to be accepted.
So you're saying to do with the sort of generator, or to just
I was kind of the opinion that like that sounds more like a regression, something we didn't expect.
Mm-hmm.
So like we made a change and now things occur that we didn't expect, and that test being there, you leave it there, you fix what was broken about it, and you add a test to prevent it from happening again.
Mm-hmm.
So you may keep this test, or with the hyphen example, you change the name to Curtis Johnson with a dash in the middle, and now that test, if it make that test pass, you know, you can red and green.
Yeah.
And, you know, you had a bad test in that case, right? And you don't know, you can't predict that kind of stuff. Your best test is your responses. Yeah.
well, that's what I mean, but it's like the idea is to hopefully be more likely to catch things before they get to a user having a bug and then having to test. Like that's valuable, but it's sort of after the fact.
Mhm.
Right? Like
I would say that your spec is, or your specification is test a lot at that point. You might want to try mutation testing or something like that to like drive out new test cases. That would be my kind of like way to address that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a lot of experience in that, but that's
I think too, I mean, it sounds like you, and a part of this is like listen, you know, part of my message here is like listen to the pain you're feeling, you know, and, you know, I've talked about, I think that what I've advocated is probably a good rule of thumb, but it may not work all the time. It may not work in your case, and you may have those situations where it doesn't work, and that's fine. I think you adapt your testing strategy to like what's most effective, right? I find that basically I think of it as a system. With testing, you've got inputs and you've got outputs in some ways. You know, sometimes side effects or whatever, but like and so if you're controlling what is going in and you're making assertions about what's going out and being explicit about it, I find that that helps you outline like the box that you're operating in. But it may not be, just like the example about the IDs, you know, or whatever, the auto-generated thing, it may not always work well, so.
So when you're writing your tests,
Mhm.
like which part of the free setup that you said business setup and confirmation,
Yeah,
which part do you start with?
yeah, I mean, I write the business promise first, yeah, like whatever if I would start with Yeah, like in the business promise, that's what I mean. I just mean test description. That's my way of saying like what the description is supposed to be, is like a business promise. Something that's a feature and that describes the role, what is the role of this thing in the system and what's it doing now as it concerns the test.
So, like maybe an example would be, so you are in, you're doing like the checkout POS, and it says, ask the user if they would like an email receipt. Would be the description, and then, and then the confirmation is that some way of testing that the system generated the prompt says, would you like an email receipt?
Right.
You're testing that.
I mean, I get that.
Yeah.
I'm saying like, I'm saying in what order, because it's like, my issue that I've had with tests
Mhm.
is that it's like playing Jeopardy. You get the answer, but you need to know how to ask the question. You know? So, one guy suggested to me, was like, start with your assertion first,
Mm.
and then make the setup, when you have,
Yeah.
make the setup work, confirm your assertion.
Okay.
That was like one thing that was suggested to me, but I mean, I wanted to see like how.
That depends on the familiarity with the DSL.
Yeah.
If you know all the R-Spec ins and outs, then it's really easy to know exactly what's right. If you don't, start with what you do know how to write and then just build up.
Yeah. And
You're writing your test after you write your code, or you're writing your test first. If you write your code first, you're identifying the area that you know you're trying to write a spec for. That's when you're probably, your brain's going to start with the assertion. Go backwards. If you already test first, you want to start with business.
But if you look at the if clauses up there, right, those tests, like they are basically pseudocode for the insertion.
right.
Right? I mean,
Yep.
you're just now translating the syntax. So you effectively are writing your insertion first.
But this is also kind of a trivial example,
Yep.
for a presentation. I mean, but you can see that, right? But it's going to be one amongst 5 pages of tests about, your business process.
Mhm.
And that's even before we start getting whether you are doing end-to-end testing or you're testing on like a model level.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, exactly. I think that I think that to get to the point, like I think that just familiarity with the testing framework and familiarity with the problem domain probably determines where you start. Like,
To me, that's the answer to this question.
which is like what do you?
Just two way, like, which way
Yeah.
do it, whether it's business setup confirmation, or is it business confirmation setup, or
Mhm.
confirmation business setup?
I would probably write it in 1, 2, 3 order, but that's where I am, I guess, in development. And I've been working on this project for a long time. Like I know, like I've been working on the same project for like 6 years, so I'm very familiar with the models and my testing style and stuff like that. So I would probably write, to answer your question, I would probably write, it exposes full name first, open new line. I know that what I'm testing is going to be an instance of a user class, so I need to create a user. So I do the setup next. If I were to write the assertion first, asserting something about a user, well, I don't have a reference for that yet. It may not exist yet. So I do the setup, and then I write the assertions. Yeah.
So I write tests a little bit interestingly. I don't want to sidetrack too much about this short. I generally stick one to the happy path.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, this is how it should work.
Yep.
And then I put on my hacker hat, and I think, what are all the things that the
Yeah.
system should not allow?
Mm-hmm.
And I write tests that exercise those. Those are my abuser stories.
Yep.
And then finally, the set of tests I write are my edge cases. Like, what are the things that could cause a problem? And this, I don't know that there's an easy way to say a rule of thumb other than, as a developer, you have to know like what that is. It's like there's $1 billion order. Does that blow things up? There's a negative $5 order. Does that blow things up? Like, your edge cases that you need to handle. So I do happy path, evil stories, and then edge cases.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Descriptive and meaningful phrases instead of
Okay, yeah. I haven't heard that, yeah. That's good.
It's helped me, like, write tests that, yes, have a lot more words and probably a lot more memory consumption in some cases. They fix, or they properly test what I'm trying to achieve versus like, oh, this, I'm only setting this variable up once and I can reuse it in 7 different places, not to mention, not mentioning the fact that I have to change it 6 times.
Yep. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I wanted to throw something out there, but one way I do it is I'll start out with the business problems, and then I start with the assertion, like trying to figure out, like, okay, what would tell me that this business problem is true, and then work my way backward from there. If I'm like working in a TDD type environment, what I do is I basically just fix the errors until that assertion actually works, right? So I'll say expect the user to do X, right? No user gets a reference error, fix that. What should it, how should the user be instantiated, all those kind of things. I don't know if that answered it, but I found that flow really well. So like set up class. Yeah, set up class. I started like with like beginning with the end in mind kind of thing, right? Like what do I expect this to do? And so, hey, I expect it to do this. Okay, great. I have that assertion. Now let me work my way backwards from there so that I can get to the set of class. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I haven't heard of that, but that makes a lot of sense. It helps you solve the problem. And yeah, I agree. I think it's about confidence. You know, like what does it take to give you confidence that things are working correctly, that you've got your bases covered, and you know, when you come back to it a year from now, or somebody else works on it, are they going to have that same level of confidence? Is it going to give them that? And so I find that because the R-Spec style basically it's kind of very programmy. Like it's like an application you have to understand that pairs against your regular application. I find that it makes a lot of sense if you were the one who wrote it and you have a good memory of like what it was, because you basically still got, like from last time you touched it or whatever, you've still got it partially loaded into the context loaded into your fast brain, right? Like, and so you can get in there and you're like, oh yeah, this one, and it's overridden here and this other stuff. But like, I find that that's harder, that you pay that penalty of understanding if somebody has to come in and operate on the code after the fact, or maintain that test, or support that class, because they're going to have to first understand the application of your test code, you know. And if you can make that simpler, and I'm not saying that mine is the simplest way or the right way, it's the wrong way. That's what we said. But like but it's trying to make it simpler, minimize that upfront cost you have to pay just to get in and understand and be productive in the test suite. Cool. Well, thanks. This was great. I'm glad to give this presentation. I'm glad I got a fairly warm reception instead of like rotten tomatoes and stuff like that for you know. But thank you very much.